For most of human history, ordinary people had no voice. Kings ruled with absolute power. Empires rose and fell under the command of a single ruler. And questioning authority could cost a person their life. But thousands of years ago, a dangerous idea began to spread. An idea that power should not belong to kings, but to the people. It was an idea that sparked revolutions, destroyed empires, and reshaped the entire world. Welcome to Untold Reality Daily, where we uncover the hidden stories that shaped our world. Today we explore the origin of democracy, the powerful and turbulent journey of how humanity first began to rule itself. Before democracy, the age of kings. Long before elections, constitutions, and parliaments, the world was ruled by kings. In the ancient world, power rarely belonged to ordinary people. It belonged to rulers who claimed authority through bloodline, conquest, or divine right. Kings were not simply leaders. They were often believed to be chosen by the gods themselves. Questioning their authority could be seen as an act of rebellion, or even blasphemy. Across vast kingdoms and early civilizations, the idea that common citizens could have a say in how they were governed simply did not exist. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh ruled as a living god. His word was law, and the people served the throne without question. Massive monuments, temples, and pyramids rose from the desert sands, built by generations who lived and died under the command of a single ruler. In Mesopotamia, powerful kings governed city-states surrounded by towering walls. Leaders like Hammurabi established strict laws that controlled every aspect of life, from trade and agriculture to punishment and justice. But while these laws created order, they did not give the people a voice. Authority still rested in the hands of the king. Farther east, powerful dynasties ruled ancient China. Emperors governed vast territories under what was called the mandate of heaven, the belief that the heavens themselves had granted the emperor the right to rule. If the emperor maintained order and prosperity, the gods favored him. If disaster struck, it was believed that heaven had withdrawn its support. Yet even here, ordinary people had little influence over the decisions that shaped their lives. Across continents, one pattern repeated itself again and again. Power flowed from the top down. A king commanded. The people obeyed. In many places, society was rigidly divided into classes. Nobles and elites controlled land, wealth, and political influence. Farmers, laborers, and soldiers made up the majority of the population, but they had little say in the systems that governed them. Even justice was often controlled by rulers. A king could reward loyalty or punish dissent with absolute authority. But as civilizations grew larger and more complex, something began to change. Cities expanded. Trade networks spread across regions. Populations increased. And with these changes came new tensions. Merchants began to accumulate wealth. Soldiers gained influence through military service. Philosophers and thinkers began asking questions about power, justice, and the nature of leadership. Slowly, the old idea that only kings could rule began to face quiet resistance. In certain parts of the ancient world, people began to imagine something different. What if power did not belong only to a single ruler? What if decisions could be made collectively? What if citizens themselves could participate in government? These questions would eventually lead to one of the most revolutionary ideas in human history. But that idea would not emerge in the palaces of kings. It would rise in a small, rugged land surrounded by mountains and sea, a place where rival cities competed fiercely for power, influence, and survival. That place was ancient Greece. And within one of its city-states, a bold political experiment would begin. An experiment that would change the course of history forever. The birth of democracy. The birth of democracy in ancient Athens. Around 2,500 years ago, along the rocky coast of the Mediterranean Sea, stood a city unlike any other in the ancient world. This city was Athens. At first, Athens was not a democracy. Like many other societies of its time, it was ruled by powerful aristocrats, wealthy landowners who controlled politics, land, and influence. A small group of elite families made decisions for everyone else, while farmers, craftsmen, and laborers had almost no voice in government. For many ordinary citizens, life was difficult. Poor farmers often borrowed money from wealthy landowners just to survive harsh seasons. When they could not repay their debts, they sometimes lost their land, and in extreme cases, even their freedom. Some were forced into debt slavery. This growing inequality created deep tension within Athenian society. The gap between the rich and the poor continued to widen, and unrest began to spread throughout the city. Athens stood on the edge of chaos. If something did not change, the city risked falling into civil conflict. It was during this dangerous period that a man named Solon emerged as one of Athens's most important reformers. Solon was a respected statesman and lawmaker, chosen by the people to address the growing crisis. Rather than protecting the power of the aristocrats, he introduced bold reforms that reshaped Athenian society. One of his most revolutionary actions was the cancellation of debt slavery. Citizens who had been enslaved because of unpaid debts were freed, and laws were established to prevent this from happening again. But Solon's reforms went even further. Instead of allowing only aristocrats to influence government, he created a system that allowed citizens from different economic classes to participate in political life. While wealth still played a role in determining political power, more people now had access to the decision-making process than ever before. For the first time, the seeds of shared political participation had been planted. Yet Athens was still far from becoming a true democracy. Power struggles continued, and in the years that followed, the city experienced periods of tyranny, where individual rulers seized control of the government. But these struggles also revealed something important. The people of Athens had begun to taste political participation, and they were not willing to give it up. Decades later, another leader would push the city even further toward a new system of governance. His name was Cleisthenes, often called the father of Athenian democracy. Cleisthenes introduced reforms that would fundamentally change how Athens was governed. Instead of organizing citizens based on family wealth or noble lineage, he reorganized the population into new political groups called tribes. These groups mixed people from different regions and backgrounds, reducing the power of aristocratic families. More importantly, Cleisthenes created a council that represented these tribes and helped guide political decisions for the city. But the most revolutionary idea of all was this: ordinary male citizens could now gather in a public assembly and vote directly on laws and policies. This assembly became the heart of Athenian democracy. Thousands of citizens could meet, debate issues, propose laws, and cast votes that would determine the direction of their city. For the first time in history, a government was built on the principle that citizens, not kings, had the authority to rule. The word used to describe this new system came from two Greek terms: demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning power or rule. Together they formed a powerful idea: democracy, rule by the people. But this early democracy was not perfect. Women could not vote. Enslaved people had no rights. Foreign residents living in Athens were excluded from political participation. Even so, the experiment unfolding in Athens was unlike anything the world had ever seen. a society where citizens debated laws in open assemblies, where leaders could be challenged, where power, at least in theory, came from the people themselves. This fragile political experiment would inspire philosophers, shape governments, and echo through history for thousands of years. But democracy in Athens would not remain stable forever. War, ambition, and political rivalries would soon test whether this new system could survive. And the greatest challenge was about to arrive, a conflict that would shake the Greek world to its core, the Peloponnesian War, when democracy almost died. By the time democracy had taken root in Athens, the city had grown powerful. Philosophers debated ideas that would shape the future of human thought, force in the Greek world. But power often attracts rivals. Its navy dominated the Aegean Sea. Its merchants traded across distant lands. Its Athens had become not only a center of culture and learning, but also a powerful political. To the south stood another great Greek city-state, Sparta. Unlike Athens, Sparta was not a democracy. It was a rigid military society ruled by a small group of elite warriors. Discipline, obedience, and strength defined Spartan life. From childhood, Spartan boys were trained to become soldiers, preparing for a lifetime of warfare. While Athens celebrated debate, philosophy, and public participation, Sparta valued order, control, and military supremacy. The two cities represented completely different visions of society, and tension between them slowly began to grow. Allies formed on both sides. Smaller Greek city-states were pulled into the conflict as loyalties hardened and rivalries deepened. Then, in 431 BCE, war finally erupted. History would remember this conflict as the Peloponnesian War. For nearly 3 decades, Athens and Sparta fought a brutal struggle for dominance over the Greek world. At first, Athens relied on its powerful navy to maintain control of its vast network of allies. The city protected itself behind enormous defensive walls while its fleets raided Spartan territories. But war brings suffering to even the strongest societies. A devastating plague struck Athens early in the conflict. The disease spread rapidly through the crowded city, killing thousands of people. Among the dead was one of Athens's most influential leaders, Pericles, a statesman who had been a strong supporter of the democratic system. Without strong leadership, Athens began to fracture politically. Public debates in the assembly became more chaotic. Ambitious politicians rose to power by promising victory and glory, often pushing the city into risky military decisions. One of the most disastrous moments came when Athens launched a massive military expedition to conquer Sicily. The campaign ended in catastrophe. The Athenian fleet was destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were captured or killed. The city lost enormous resources and military strength. Sensing weakness, Sparta intensified its attacks. After years of grinding warfare, Athens was finally defeated in 404 BCE. The consequences were severe. Sparta dismantled Athens' powerful navy and forced the city to surrender. But the greatest blow came when the democratic government itself was overthrown. In its place, a small group of oligarchs took power. They became known as the 30 Tyrants. This regime ruled Athens with fear and brutality. Political opponents were executed, property was seized, and many citizens were forced into exile. The democracy that had once allowed citizens to debate freely and vote on laws seemed to have vanished. For a moment in history, it appeared that the great experiment of democracy had failed. But the people of Athens were not willing to accept tyranny forever. Within a year, a group of exiled citizens organized a resistance movement. They gathered supporters, marched back toward Athens, and fought to restore their political rights. Eventually, the tyrants were overthrown. Democracy returned. Though weakened by war and internal struggles, the people of Athens had reclaimed their system of government. The experiment had survived its first great crisis, but Athens would never again dominate the Greek world as it once had. And while democracy continued in Athens for a time, another powerful civilization was beginning to rise far to the west. A civilization that would build one of the greatest political systems of the ancient world. A system that borrowed ideas from democracy, but blended them with something entirely new. This civilization was Rome, and its political experiment would shape the future of government for centuries. The Roman Republic experiment. While Athens struggled through war and political turmoil, another civilization was quietly developing its own system of governance. This civilization was Rome. According to ancient tradition, Rome was originally ruled by kings. Early Roman society functioned much like many other ancient states. Power rested in the hands of a monarch who controlled the military, the courts, and the laws of the land. But around 509 BCE, something extraordinary happened. The Roman people rose up against their final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, whose rule had become increasingly tyrannical. Stories from Roman history describe a growing anger among the citizens and noble families who believed the king had abused his power. Eventually, the monarchy was overthrown. In its place, Rome created an entirely new political system. It was called the Roman Republic. Unlike the direct democracy practiced in Athens, the Roman Republic introduced a different approach to governance, one that relied on representation, shared power, and carefully balanced authority. Instead of a king ruling alone, Rome established a system where multiple institutions worked together to govern the state. At the center of this system was the Senate, a powerful council made up primarily of Rome's elite families, known as the patricians. The Senate advised leaders, controlled finances, and influenced many of the major political decisions of the Republic. But the Senate was not the only source of power. Each year, Roman citizens elected two officials known as consuls. These consuls acted as the chief leaders of the Republic, commanding the army and overseeing the government. However, their power was carefully limited. Each consul could veto the decisions of the other. This system ensured that no single individual could easily dominate the government. Rome also created assemblies where citizens could vote on laws and elect officials. Although political participation was still limited, the idea that citizens had a role in shaping government continued to grow. Yet, like Athens before it, the Roman Republic struggled with inequality. Roman society was deeply divided between two main classes: the patricians, who held most of the wealth and political influence, and the plebeians, who represented the majority of the population. For many years, plebeians fought to gain greater rights and representation within the government. This struggle became known as the conflict of the orders. Through protests, negotiations, and political pressure, the plebeians slowly gained more influence. They secured the right to elect their own representatives, known as tribunes of the plebs, officials who could veto decisions that harmed the interests of ordinary citizens. Over time, Rome created written laws known as the 12 Tables, which established clear legal rights and protections for citizens. These developments marked important steps toward a more balanced political system. The Roman Republic had created something new, a government that blended aristocratic leadership, citizen participation, and legal institutions designed to limit absolute power. For centuries, this system helped Rome grow from a small city into one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. Its armies conquered vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its roads, laws, and institutions connected millions of people under a single government. But as Rome grew larger, its political system became increasingly strained. Ambitious generals gained enormous military power. Political rivalries intensified, and the balance that once protected the Republic began to break apart. Eventually, one man would rise above the chaos, a leader whose ambition would bring the Roman Republic to an end. His name was Julius Caesar, and his rise would once again change the course of democracy. The fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of empire. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic had become the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. Rome controlled vast territories stretching across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Its armies were feared, its roads connected distant provinces, and its wealth flowed from conquered lands. But beneath this success, the Republic was beginning to fracture. The political system that once balanced power between leaders and citizens was now strained by corruption, ambition, and fierce rivalries among Rome's elite. Generals who commanded powerful armies began to gain enormous personal influence. Soldiers often became loyal not just to Rome, but to the commanders who led them to victory and rewarded them with land and wealth. One of these generals would soon change the fate of the Republic forever. His name was Julius Caesar. Caesar was a brilliant military leader and an ambitious politician. Through a series of military campaigns, particularly his conquest of Gaul, he gained immense popularity among the Roman people and loyalty from his battle-hardened legions. But his growing power made many members of the Roman Senate uneasy. They feared that Caesar might attempt to seize complete control of the government. In 49 BCE, tensions reached a breaking point. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar refused. Instead, he made a decision that would ignite one of the most famous moments in Roman history. He marched his army across the Rubicon River, a boundary that Roman law forbade any general from crossing with troops. As he crossed, Caesar reportedly declared that the die had been cast. Civil war had begun. Caesar's forces moved swiftly, defeating his rivals and gaining control of Rome. Within a few years, he had emerged as the undisputed leader of the Republic. Eventually, the Senate granted him an extraordinary title, dictator for life. To some Romans, Caesar was a hero who brought stability to a chaotic political system. To others, he was a threat to the very idea of the Republic. A group of senators began to fear that Caesar intended to make himself king, something Romans had rejected centuries earlier when they overthrew their monarchy. Determined to protect the Republic, these senators formed a conspiracy. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate chamber. There he was surrounded by dozens of conspirators. Within moments they attacked. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Among the attackers was a man he trusted deeply, Marcus Junius Brutus. According to tradition, Caesar looked at him in shock and uttered words that would echo through history. Et tu, Brute? Even you, Brutus? The conspirators believed that killing Caesar would save the Roman Republic. But instead of restoring stability, the assassination plunged Rome into another period of violent civil war. Power struggles erupted between rival leaders. Armies clashed across the Roman world. And eventually one man emerged victorious. His name was Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. In 27 BCE, Octavian took a new title, Augustus. Though he maintained the appearance of republican institutions, Augustus effectively became the first emperor of Rome. The Roman Republic was over. In its place stood the Roman Empire, a powerful monarchy disguised beneath the old structures of the Republic. For centuries afterward, emperors would rule Rome with varying degrees of power and authority. The experiment of republican governance had collapsed, and with it, many of the early ideas that had once inspired political participation and shared power. Across much of the world, kings and emperors would once again dominate political life. The dream of government by the people would fade for many centuries. But it would never disappear entirely. Hidden within philosophy, law, and the memories of ancient republics, the idea of democracy waited for the right moment to rise again. That moment would not come until a new era of thought began to sweep across Europe. An era that challenged kings, questioned authority, and reimagined the very foundations of government. It was called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, when democracy was reborn. For many centuries after the fall of the Roman Republic, most of the world returned to systems ruled by kings, emperors, and powerful dynasties. Across Europe, monarchs claimed that their authority came directly from God. This belief became known as the divine right of kings. According to this idea, a king was chosen by divine will, and therefore his power could not be questioned by ordinary people. To challenge the king was to challenge heaven itself. Massive kingdoms rose across the continent. Royal courts controlled armies, land, and wealth. Noble families dominated political life, while the majority of people had little influence over how they were governed. For generations, this system remained largely unchallenged. But beginning in the 1600s and continuing into the 1700s, a powerful intellectual movement began to spread across Europe. It was called the Enlightenment. During this era, philosophers, scientists, and writers began questioning long-held beliefs about power, authority, and the rights of individuals. Instead of accepting tradition without question, they encouraged people to think critically about how society should be organized. Many Enlightenment thinkers began revisiting the political ideas of ancient Greece and Rome. They asked bold questions. Should power truly belong to kings alone? Do people possess natural rights that governments must protect? And perhaps most importantly, who should have the authority to rule? One of the most influential thinkers of this period was John Locke, an English philosopher whose ideas would transform political thought. Locke argued that all human beings were born with certain natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property. According to Locke, governments did not exist to control people. Instead, governments existed to protect these natural rights. If a ruler failed to protect them, the people had the right to challenge that authority. This idea was revolutionary. It suggested that political power ultimately came from the consent of the governed, not from divine authority or royal bloodlines. Another influential philosopher, Baron de Montesquieu, studied the structure of governments and warned about the dangers of concentrated power. Montesquieu believed that freedom could only survive if political authority was divided among separate branches of government. This concept would later become known as the separation of powers. Meanwhile, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau proposed an even more radical idea. Rousseau argued that true political authority should come directly from the collective will of the people, what he called the general will. In his view, legitimate governments must reflect the desires and interests of the citizens they represent. These ideas began spreading rapidly across Europe and beyond. Books, pamphlets, and political writings circulated among scholars, merchants, and even ordinary citizens. The Enlightenment sparked debates about liberty, justice, and the structure of government. Slowly, the belief that kings possessed unquestionable authority began to weaken. People began imagining a world where power did not belong solely to monarchs, but to the citizens themselves. These ideas would soon ignite some of the most dramatic political revolutions in human history, revolutions that would challenge centuries of monarchy, revolutions that would attempt to build governments based on democratic principles. The first of these great upheavals would take place in the American colonies, and its success would inspire movements across the entire world, the revolutions that changed the world. By the late 1700s, the ideas of the Enlightenment had begun to spread far beyond the libraries and salons of European philosophers. Merchants discussed them in crowded ports. Writers published them in pamphlets and newspapers. And ordinary citizens began to question the authority of kings. Nowhere would these ideas ignite change more dramatically than in the American colonies. At the time, 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America. These colonies were governed by the British Crown, and for many years they had accepted the authority of the king. But tensions began to rise when Britain imposed new taxes and regulations on the colonies after costly wars. Many colonists grew frustrated. They argued that if they had no representatives in the British Parliament, then the government had no right to tax them. Their rallying cry became famous: "No taxation without representation." Inspired by the ideas of philosophers like John Locke, colonial leaders began to argue that government should exist only with the consent of the people. In 1776, these tensions erupted into open rebellion. The American colonies declared independence from Britain and published one of the most influential political documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the document boldly declared that all men were created equal and possessed certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. More importantly, it declared that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed. This was a direct challenge to centuries of monarchical rule. After years of war, the American colonies succeeded in gaining independence and formed a new nation, the United States of America. Soon afterward, they drafted a constitution that established a government based on representation, elections, and a system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one leader from gaining absolute power. The success of this revolution sent shockwaves across the world. If a group of colonies could overthrow a king and build a government based on democratic principles, others might attempt the same. And only a few years later, a far more explosive revolution would erupt in Europe, this time in France. In 1789, the French kingdom was facing a deep crisis. The monarchy had accumulated enormous debt, food shortages plagued the population, and inequality between the rich and poor had reached dangerous levels. While the aristocracy and clergy enjoyed privileges and wealth, ordinary citizens struggled to survive. Inspired by Enlightenment ideas and the success of the American Revolution, the French people began demanding political reform. Protests grew larger. Anger spread through the streets of Paris. Then, in one of the most iconic moments of revolutionary history, a crowd stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized royal authority. The French Revolution had begun. In the years that followed, the revolution would topple the monarchy, execute King Louis XVI, and attempt to establish a government based on liberty, equality, and the will of the people. But the revolution also descended into chaos and violence. Political factions fought for power. Thousands were executed during a period known as the Reign of Terror. Eventually, the turmoil gave rise to another powerful leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, who would crown himself emperor. Despite its turbulence, the French Revolution had permanently altered the political landscape of Europe. The idea that citizens could challenge kings and demand political rights had now taken root across the continent. Democracy was no longer just a philosophical concept. It had become a powerful force capable of reshaping nations. But the journey of democracy was far from complete. The real test would come in the centuries that followed. As nations industrialized, populations grew, and societies transformed, the question remained: could democratic governments survive in a rapidly changing world? The answer would begin to unfold in the 1900s. Democracy in the 1900s. As the world entered the 1900s, democracy was no longer a fragile experiment confined to a few nations. It had begun to spread. Countries across Europe and the Americas started adopting constitutions, expanding voting rights, and building representative governments. More citizens were gaining the ability to participate in elections and influence political decisions. But the rise of democracy did not come without fierce resistance. The early decades of the 1900s were marked by enormous global upheaval. Industrialization had transformed economies, cities were expanding rapidly, and political tensions between powerful nations were growing. Then, in 1914, the world was plunged into one of the most devastating conflicts in human history: World War I. The war lasted 4 brutal years and reshaped the global political landscape. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives as empires clashed across Europe and beyond. When the war finally ended in 1918, several powerful monarchies collapsed. The German Empire fell. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. The Russian Empire was swept away by revolution. In the aftermath of the war, many nations attempted to establish democratic governments. Leaders and citizens hoped that new political systems based on representation and public participation could prevent future global conflicts. But the path forward proved far more difficult than many had imagined. Economic instability, political polarization, and social unrest created fertile ground for new forms of authoritarian rule. In the 1920s and 1930s, powerful dictators rose to power in several countries. In Italy, Benito Mussolini established a fascist regime that rejected democratic institutions and concentrated power in the hands of the state. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose to power during a period of deep economic crisis and political instability. His regime dismantled democratic institutions and replaced them with a brutal dictatorship. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin ruled through a system of centralized authority that allowed little political freedom. Once again, democracy faced one of its greatest threats. The world would soon be pulled into another catastrophic conflict. In 1939, World War II began. For 6 years, nations around the globe fought a massive struggle between authoritarian regimes and countries that sought to defend democratic ideals. The war ended in 1945 with the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. In the years that followed, democracy experienced a powerful resurgence. New democratic governments were established in parts of Europe and Asia. Nations rebuilt their political systems with renewed commitments to human rights, political participation, and the rule of law. International organizations were also formed to help protect peace and cooperation between nations. One of the most significant was the United Nations, founded in 1945. Yet even during this period of expansion, democracy continued to face challenges. The Cold War divided the world into competing political systems. Some nations embraced democratic governance, while others adopted communist or authoritarian regimes. Despite these tensions, the late 1900s saw democracy expand across many parts of the globe. Countries in Eastern Europe transitioned away from authoritarian rule. Nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America experimented with democratic systems as they gained independence from colonial powers. By the end of the 20th century, democracy had become one of the most widely practiced forms of government in the world. But the story of democracy was far from finished. Because democracy is not a permanent achievement. It is an idea that must be protected, challenged, and continuously shaped by the people who live under it. And as the 21st century unfolds, humanity continues to grapple with the same question that began thousands of years ago in ancient Athens. Who should hold power, and how should that power be used? The future of democracy. More than 2,000 years have passed since citizens first gathered in the assembly of ancient Athens to debate the future of their city. Since then, democracy has traveled a long and turbulent road. It survived the collapse of empires. It endured wars, revolutions, and political upheavals. It inspired philosophers, fueled independence movements, and reshaped the governments of entire nations. Yet the story of democracy has never been simple. From the very beginning, democracy has faced constant challenges. In ancient Athens, participation was limited, and the system struggled under the pressures of war. In Rome, a republic designed to prevent tyranny eventually collapsed under the weight of ambition and political conflict. In the modern era, democracies have sometimes faltered, giving way to authoritarian rule when fear, economic crises, or political divisions weakened public institutions. But despite these setbacks, the core idea behind democracy has continued to endure. The belief that ordinary people should have a voice in how they are governed. Today, billions of people around the world live under democratic systems that allow citizens to vote, debate public policies, and influence their governments. But democracy is not something that simply exists on its own. It requires participation. It requires accountability. And above all, it requires citizens who are willing to protect it. Throughout history, democracy has always depended on the willingness of people to question authority, defend their rights, and shape the future of their societies. The same questions that echoed through the assemblies of ancient Greece still resonate today. How should power be distributed? How can freedom be protected? And how can governments truly represent the will of the people? These questions will continue to shape the future of democracy for generations to come. Because democracy is not just a political system. It is an ongoing experiment in human cooperation, responsibility, and collective decision-making. And the outcome of that experiment depends on the choices made by each generation. The story of democracy is still being written, and every citizen plays a part in determining where that story leads next. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more powerful stories that shaped our world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Untold Reality Daily, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future documentaries. Here on Untold Reality Daily, we uncover the forgotten truths, hidden histories, and untold realities that continue to shape the world we live in today. Thank you for watching.